Is his microphone on? Yes. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Alice Russo. I work for the RFC Production Center. I'm living in Seattle, but I work for AMS, which is based in Fremont, California. This tutorial is to talk about the options, and specifically we go over XML to RFC and nroff edit in more detail. Also brief intros to a couple of the other options. One is cram down RFC 2629, which uses Markdown to create a text output or XML output. If you're used to working on wiki pages, you might be happiest with that option. And links to RFC, which relies on links, which I understand is popular in academia. And there will be time for questions. Also, if you have any questions along the way or you don't understand what I said, I spoke too quickly, then feel free to ask a question in the middle as well. So just to get a general feel for what tools people are already familiar with, can you raise your hand if you've used XML to RFC to create an internet draft before? Great. And raise your hand if you have XML to RFC installed on your machine, you run it locally, as opposed to on the online converter. Okay, so about half of the people using XML to RFC have it installed locally. How about nroff edit? Has anyone ever used nroff edit to make an internet draft? One person. And then getting a feel for these other two, cram down RFC 2629. Anybody use that? How about pandoc to RFC? So another markdown option that's not on this. Nope. How about licks to RFC, which is listed there? Nope. Okay. I'd say XML to RFC is really popular from what we're seeing in terms of, I only see the internet drafts that are approved for publication as RFCs, but a lot of people are using XML to RFC. How they actually get to that XML file, there are various paths, some of which I'll talk about today. So basically this is geared for at the beginning of your process. So this slide's from Scott Bradner's newcomer tutorial, but before it even goes to the working group, you're working on your draft, it's a good time to choose your authoring tool. And some people don't choose, and then later they have co-authors who say, oh, I'd really like to do this in XML to RFC, or whatever their favorite. Oh, that's one of the other ones I didn't ask about is the Word template. Has anyone used the Microsoft Word template to create an internet draft? Okay, a couple. So, you know, you don't have to stick with the same authoring tool through this whole process, but it helps if you choose at the beginning when you're authoring your internet draft something that works for you so that you can focus on the content and less so on the formatting. So going through some of the options here, nroff edit is using an INROF source file. The tool credit is Stefan Santason, and this is the website where it's available. You install it as a GUI that's a side-by-side. You see the INROF on one side and the text output on the other side. It starts off with a template for an internet draft. It has easy reference creation, meaning you put in an RFC number and it just pops in the reference information. Automatically creates your table of contents. TOC stands for table of contents. And in brief, you edit within the application. I'd say this is a pretty easy one for someone who's scared of XML and doesn't want to do Microsoft Word. INROF edit's pretty quick to start. XML to RFC is one that a lot of people in the room were already familiar with. You can install it or you can just run it in the web converter. I recommend the web converter for a lot of people because it's always going to be up to date. The template for the ID, there are lots of them available from the tools.ietf.org site and from the RFC editor site. This is probably the most comprehensive reference creation that you have because it's not just RFCs, it's also internet drafts, and then there's citation library for IEEE references, and I'll be going into more detail on this, but also for other SDOs. Documents not necessarily as up to date as is useful, but it's a good starting point. The table of contents is created automatically. You can edit in your favorite editor and then run the converter. There is a V2 that if you install it locally, it has a GUI, and you can theoretically edit in there, but it's pretty lightweight. The Word template relies on Microsoft Word, and it's written up completely in RFC 5385. You run it in your own copy of Word. There is a template to start with. It's not quite as easy for making references. And you do have to run a Perl script. After you use a special template with special margins set, etc., then you run a Perl script to get the plain text output. Yes? So the question is, I'm just saying the question into the mic. So the question is, what operating systems do these run on? So right, Word, wherever you have Word installed. The XML to RFC, there's a Windows package and a Mac package. I'm not actually sure if, how it works for others. And then INROF Edit definitely has a Mac package, I think. I'll look at the site later in the tutorial, so it's worth going to check this. So looking at some of the other options, the one on the left, cram down RFC 2629, and the one on the right, pandoc to RFC, are both markdown. So that's, you know, the rich text basically that you use to create a wiki page, very similar. Cram down, it has a GitHub page. Also, there was a tutorial at IETF92 that went into the details of cram down. And I'll be going over more detail in this tutorial. But basically, the file that you create is markdown, but also some YAML, which is a subset of JSON. And you run the converter, and you can get an XML file that you then feed to XML to RFC to get your plain text. The links to RFC also has a GitHub page. I mean, all of these do because they're work in progress to a certain extent. Yeah, the converter relies on various software for links to RFC that you have to have installed, so it's worth going to read the documentation to see if it's something that you already have. You probably know if you already use LaTeX or LIX that you would like this one. Pandoc to RFC is written up in RFC 7328. It's fairly similar to cram down RFC 2629 in terms of the markup, but they made different decisions about how to handle internet draft specific things like references and figures and tables, references within the document. Okay, so I'm going to go into more detail on INROF edit. It's what you see is what you get. It's a side-by-side view. You download it. It has spell checker built in, a template built in that gets updated. Why would you choose it? Because it's an easy way to make an internet draft that's going to be accepted by IDNITs. It automatically does some of the things for you. Generating the references from RFC ref text, that's a plain text file provided by the RFC editor. So it's going to be up to date with the right format and also the most recently published RFCs. It's pretty straightforward. You could provide also the INROF file if your document was accepted for publication, approved for publication as an RFC, you could provide the INROF file to the RFC editor and we would use it. We edit INROF files and we edit XML files during the publication process. That said, you don't have to have a source file to provide. If your document's approved, we will create a source file if you, for example, edited plain text from scratch or used the Microsoft Word template. So quick start with INROF edit, you download, you install, and you say new draft from template. It builds the reference list automatically. It's the same file that I mentioned. There's the preloaded template, which you can also just download if you want it. If you, for example, you want to run INROF on the command line. Basically, INROF markup is simplistic and makes text output. There's another INROF template available from the RFC editor site. And I meant to say at the beginning, these slides are available from rfceditor.org/materials/ the name of this tutorial, basically, but I can put the link up later. It's also available from the EduTeam wiki pages. So it's INROF basics. The commands all start with a period. It's very basic. I mean, INROF was developed decades ago. So you tell it exactly how much you want to indent. You tell it if you want text to be wrapped or not wrapped. Line breaks and page breaks and keeping lines together, it's all very explicit. So to contrast with XML to RFC, you wouldn't be worrying about things like this. With XML to RFC, it's going to choose for you how many spaces to indent, and depending on what element you used, it chooses when to wrap the text. But if you're already familiar with this, it's not too complicated. This is a screenshot of the automated table of contents, so you're not trying to pull that together. As mentioned, the reference insertion is pretty straightforward, and you can even give the references different labels. You know, some people like to label the reference IKV2 instead of the RFC number, and it has that functionality. And then my recommendation here for if you're inserting references to other sources like internet drafts or non-RFCs, then I would recommend copying and pasting them from existing documents rather than typing them from scratch. But basically, you're just putting an indent command before each one. So this is the screenshot of the managed reference list. You can see at the top it's in an INROF comment that's ghosted out, so it's hard to see it on this slide, but basically as the author you just put in a list of numbers, of RFC numbers, optional labels, and then INROF edit's creating everything below the yellow arrow, so it's automatically creating the reference entries, which is nice. Another reason you might choose INROF edit is if you're starting with an internet draft that you don't have a source file for, because you can take an existing internet draft in plain text and feed it to INROF edit, and it will try to convert it to INROF. Assuming that internet draft that you started with is in IDNIT's form, it'll succeed, and then you'll have a source file to start with. So that would be, I'd say, the quick and easy way to get to a source file, as opposed to if you're starting with an internet draft and you want to make an XML file, there's not a really viable text to XML tool that exists currently. So it's more of a manual process, and I'll talk more about that later. There's also some integration with the IETF tools diff service, so you can see the changes and post URL. This is the automated diff generation. You can tell it's relying on RFC diff, which does the side-by-side diffs. And there's more functionality in InROF edit. Some of it's on this slide. So I was going to demo this, but I think for the sake of moving forward, basically, like I said, the text to InROF demo would be that you feed it a plain text file, and it will try to create a source file from there. Any questions about InROF edit before I move on to XML to RFC? Okay, so this is the one that there's the most familiarity in the room, but feel free to stop me if you have a question. It converts your XML source file into text, HTML, InROF, unpaginated text, or expanded XML. So you can create an internet draft that's in the right format. Also, the RFC editor can use it, change a few attributes, and it creates an RFC. It's available from XML to rfc.ietf.org, which used to be xml.resource.org, but I think there's a redirect in place. So why would you choose this? Similar reasons as InROF edit. This one has the advantage that you would get HTML output or even PDF. And then also exchanging the source file with authors is more useful if everyone likes to use XML. And you can, theoretically put metadata in it. At this point, the XML files that are uploaded to the ID submission tool, there is no automatic metadata extraction, but in theory, you could say, okay, how many of the XML files in the ID repository contain XYZ, element? And we will take your XML file. Another reason is looking toward the future. You may be aware that the RFC series editor named Heather Flanagan has been working on an effort to change the format of RFCs. So this doesn't affect you as an author of an internet draft. It's just to be aware that in the future, instead of publishing only plain text RFCs, there will be an HTML output, PDF output with nice links. This is different from the HTML versions of RFCs available from tools.ietf.org, which you may be familiar with. For more information about what the RSC is doing, take a look at the RSC format FAQ. This is slated for upcoming years, so maybe we would see this in a year. And Draft Hoffman XML.RFC is defining a new vocabulary for XML.RFC in order to add some of the functionality needed for the new output formats. So in theory, if you're choosing to use XML.RFC today, then in a couple of years, if you wanted to use your source file, you'd have XML.RFC v3 available and a converter from v2 to v3 vocabulary so that your file would make the new pretty output that's going to be available. Some people are excited about this format effort also because it will allow non-ASCII characters, for example, in your name. So back to v2. This tool was rewritten from scratch. If you're familiar with the old XML to RFC, it's now written. It's been more maintained. It is stricter. When you run the converter, you might be seeing errors that you didn't see a while ago. XML to RFC at IETF.org is the mailing list, and people just send questions there. There's also an this is the link to the reporting bugs if you're having problems with v2, but I'd say most of the bugs for v2 are ironed out, works well. So for initial setup, you have some choices if you want to use the tool on the web or install it, if you want to use the citation libraries as they're available online or maintain your own copy and edit, whatever editor you'd like to edit XML in. So if you're just want to get started as quickly as possible, just use the online converter, use the citation libraries that are available online, use your favorite text editor and edit the raw XML, as opposed to, some people want to use XML-mined and then have special configuration. You're welcome to do that, but this is the quick start. Also the template. So the templates are available here. For a generic draft, I'd recommend the Draft Davies template Bear, which has some instructions and comments. And then if you're writing a MIB, which is a specific kind of document, there's also a special template for writing a MIB available. There are some other options for creating an XML file. So the ID creation wizard kind of lets you fill out a form on the web, and then it creates the XML file for like your author element and title, basically the starting front matter. It takes care of it for you. So if I were starting with a text file that I had no source file for and I wanted to create an internet draft, I might just start with this ID wizard, because you could copy and paste from your existing draft and it would just get you started with a nice template with your author elements and all of that. Also, the markdown tools will create XML files. So Cramdown or Pandoc to RFC, as well as LixRFC, create XML files that you then could feed to XML to RFC. Just some basics for XML. The elements are nested, have open and closed tags. Excuse me, the attributes have quoted values, it's case sensitive. Replace certain characters that you don't want the XML parser to parse, like your less than sign or your ampersand. If you're putting in a big, I'll talk about this more, but if you're putting in a chunk of XML into your internet draft, then you want to use CData, a special tag for the figure artwork, so it tells it not to parse that, so you don't have to replace all the characters. This authoring document has more XML basics. So the document structure is basically a front, middle, and back. This slide doesn't have the open and close elements for each of those, but it's open front, open middle, close middle, etc. It's kind of counterintuitive in that the author information goes at the beginning of the XML file, and we're all used to seeing the author information at the end of the output, at the end of the internet draft. The tricky part, the reason that it's hard to build a text to XML converter for use with XML file to use with XML to RFC is in the middle, in your sections, when you actually get into the meat of your document, putting in figures or tables or even lists, nested lists. It's tricky to automate some of that, especially complicated tables. So if you're creating an internet draft, you want to make an author element for yourself. As I mentioned, the ID wizard can make that easy. T tags go around every paragraph. Figure artwork, both elements, go around each figure. And when you want to cite a reference, you put in an XREF. XREF standing for crossref. It's a little confusing because XREF is not only for in-text citations, it's also XREF if you want to say see section 9. You would also use XREF target equals, and you will have given an identifier to section 9 and put that as the target. Yep. The drawing? Meaning like how to create ASCII art? Okay, so the question is, am I going to talk about drawing tips or how to create figure artwork? So because, as mentioned, because the output is plain text, a lot of people have fancy ASCII art in their internet drafts. I don't really dive into that in this tutorial. My primary recommendation for getting ASCII art into your source file is to go and look at another internet draft or RFC where you like what they've done and start with that as your
Yeah, I guess it would be good to know which ones were maybe good examples to follow and not good examples to follow.
I agree. So he said it would be good to know which ones are good examples to follow and which aren't. I've actually been thinking about that lately in terms of saying some specific RFC numbers that might be good examples for bit diagrams or flowcharts that could be good starting points. Yes.
Tomáš Čejka, CESNET. I have a question. Can I put figure into paragraph? I mean figure inside of T or outside?
I actually think the DTD lets you do either one, but I don't remember off the top of my head. But it's not going to affect your spacing. Like if you close the T, close your paragraph, and you put in the figure, it's not going to give you extra white space. So I think you close the T and then open your figure generally.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Would it be possible to have a copy of your presentation?
Yes, the slides are currently available. Let me see if I can show where they are.
Thank you.
They're not. So I thought they were tools_IDs_RFCs_94.pdf. I see what materials page you were referring to. Okay. And so this page, it's on tools.itf.org. Group EduWiki tutorial by IETF has all the tutorials. And the one that I was recommending before is this Markdown and YAML tutorial. That's crammed down, the one that I mentioned earlier. But I recommend the EduWiki for finding past tutorials. Okay, I'm going back to the slides. No problem. So one question that comes up a lot for people working on XML RFC is, what am I supposed to do with the IPR attribute? So generally, trust 2009-02 is the most commonly used one. Then this pre-5378 trust 2009-02 is the one that adds an extra paragraph that has to do basically with if your text relies on old RFCs. And I recommend looking at the FAQ available from trustee.ietf.org. And all the license info is on that site. This is an empty author block. I wouldn't recommend starting with an empty author block and filling it in so much as I mentioned, the ID wizard, kind of you just fill in a form with your name and then it spits it out with your information all in the right places. If you're using lists, and IDs definitely seem to have a lot of lists, these are the styles that are available. So empty is simply indentation. You have numbers, letters, symbols is to get the bulleted list, which in ASCII comes out, the top level bullet is an O, lowercase o. but you can actually use a processing instruction. That's what the PI RFC text list symbols, you can control what the bullets are. Hanging gets used a lot for definitions. And then format %D is an example of how you could do a customized list. So it'll let you do %D for digit, %C for character, %I if you're doing Roman numerals, and you could change it like if you wanted to say rec1, rec2, rec3, you can do format rec %D, and then it'll make it the list like that. So that's the example I was just talking about for customized lists. If you're a big fan of parentheses, you could do that. So this I mentioned earlier, C data. So in a figure artwork, it won't parse the content if you put in this C data. Especially useful if you're trying to put XML or HTML into your draft, because you don't have to replace all the angle brackets. So references is usually the sticking point. As I mentioned, there are citation libraries and they have names that you can expect. So for RFCs, it's always RFC capitalized and a 4-digit identifier. And for internet drafts, it always starts with I-D. And when you don't include a version number, it chooses the most recent one. So this is a screenshot from XML to RFC webpage. So if you scroll down on that page below the converter, it lists the citation libraries that are available. And some people maintain a copy locally, but there's no need to do that, in the sense that if you're using the online converter, it recognizes the names and it'll pull the reference information from these libraries. So as mentioned, there's RFC and internet drafts, and then there's W3C documents, JSF, which is like XMPP, the Jabber documents, 3GPP documents, and then miscellaneous has a big mix of different SDOs, and they're not very up to date. There is a new one, which is bibxml6, which has IEEE documents in it. So that the content of that directory actually has been updated, so you may find it has the more recent IEEE document you want to reference. So one of the tricky parts with XML to RFC is that there are different ways to get the references to do what you want. The short way is just using an include. It's relying on an RFC specific processing instruction. So some people don't like it. The long way is that you define an entity at the top, and then you call the entity in the references section. And the really long way would be that you copy and paste in the whole, the complete reference element, which you need to do if you're referencing something that's not available in the citation libraries. Sorry?
Yes.
Okay, so the point they're making, it works offline. So if you're relying on the citation libraries and you don't have a copy of them on your machine, then it's nice to have the complete reference in there if you're trying to get output from XML to RFC while you're offline.
Although that means that you have to, when you publish a new doc, you have to go and check each of the references and manually each the nonsense themselves.
Right, so it's a sync problem, right? Because as you know, internet drafts often get replaced. So what was on version 05 when you wrote you referenced version 05 of an internet draft, and then a month later it could be on version 10. Or other SDOs documents obviously change over time. So the downside of doing number 3 is that you're basically hard coding all the content of the reference into your document. And some references are a moving target. So this is an example of the short way. You just put the include into the reference section and you get this text output based on the reference elements that are in the citation library. This is an example of the long way. At the top of the document, you have these entities. It's helpful if you're starting with a template so you know what to put in there. And then in the references section, you use the ampersand. And the really long way is to put in the whole reference element. So for RFC 2119, it doesn't really make sense to put in the whole reference because it's an easy one to use the citation library for. But if you wanted to reference a Wikipedia page or something, you know, you're going to have to make a reference from scratch. So this is the template for a reference from scratch. The DTD does require the date element, but it can be empty. So you can have an empty date element in there. Another trick with the reference from scratch is, let's say you're citing another SDO's document and you want the organization to be listed as the author. You leave the author attributes empty. So initials, surname, full name, blank. And then you put organization, you put in right now that organization element is empty, but you put in content there and then it'll list that organization as the author. Because that's helpful in that you don't have to hack the author attributes to try to get the output you want. So for reference tags, some people like to use 1 instead of RFC 2119, you know, 1, 2, 3 numeric references. You can control that with a processing instruction called symrefs. So if you set symrefs equal to no, sim means symbolic, then you would get the numbers. And also some people like to use the names instead of the RFC numbers, like mentioned IETF2. This is one of the downfalls, I think, of XML to RFC v2 is that in order to do that, you actually have to put the whole complete reference element into the document and then change the anchor. Whereas when we were talking about inrof edit, it was easy. You just put the label next to the number and it generated the right thing. Also, once you change the anchor to IETF2, then every time you want to cite that document in the body, you know, within the body of your document, you need to have xref target equals IETF2 because you've renamed it. Okay, going into the table structure in XML to RFC, it's called text table. It does not have as much functionality as an HTML table. Obviously, it's pretty basic. That's why I put the little white box in the bottom that says figure artwork elements are another option. So basically, if you want to do anything fancy with the table, like you want to have 2 rows, you know, combined rows or combined columns, you have to make it yourself. Meaning it's basically ASCII art table and you put it into a figure artwork. Text table works well for straightforward tables. Some tips, I recommend using xref for references instead of typing in square brackets into the body of your document. That would similarly for section references, you don't want to say C section 9, you want to say C xref target equals IANA considerations. And for lists, you want to use the list element, don't put the list in as a figure and do the indentation yourself. The beauty of the list element is that it'll line everything up nicely and it does nested lists just fine. So some people with V2 are seeing errors like the DTD errors that they hadn't seen before because V1 was more forgiving. For example, list is not nested in T and it gives you a message about the DTD. So the solution is you have to put a T tag around the whole list or simply leave the preceding paragraph open. Similarly, ampersands, it used to do like a best effort thing and it would not complain, but now it complains. So XML parse entity ref no name, it's basically you have an ampersand in your text, you need to replace it with the entity for an ampersand. People used to working with XML probably don't find it that tricky, but then you can put your XML file to work, you can exchange it with your co-authors. There's the ability to put just a normal XML comment inside of the XML file, or you could use the crefs functionality. There's something called a cref element, and it lets you put comments in line. You can upload your XML file to the submission tool when you post your draft. You can send your XML file, as mentioned, to the RFC editor when your document's approved. We'll already have it if you uploaded it to the submission tool. Some people like to read the HTML output of their XML file, and Julian Reschke made an XSLT that lets you have nice HTML. This is where you can go for more information about it. It's within the browser, as opposed to getting the HTML output from XML to RFC, where you feed it the XML file and say you want the HTML output, and then it runs and gives you HTML. This is just within the browser. So if your document is approved for publication and we're going to receive your XML file, we find it helpful if you consolidate your XML into one file. For example, some people use local citation libraries. Run the file using XML to RFC as available online, then we know it runs with the current version of XML to RFC. And if you're using processing instructions that are local or specific to alternate XML converters, they will be ignored by XML to RFC. So some of what you expected in output might not be there. So one problem people run into with XML to RFC is white space. How do I control the white space within my document? How do I get blank lines between list items, or compress the text so there are no blank lines? So there's a processing instruction, compact, and there's also subcompact. Compact equals yes, will not start each main section on a new page, which in the opinion of the RFC editor is good. Subcompact equals no, puts one blank line between each list item. And then vspace is an element that's kind of a hack that forces blank lines, or even can just force a line break. But hopefully you can just set compact equals yes and subcompact equals no, and you'll be happy with the output. But if you're not, you can turn them on and off within the document. And compact also affects the text table output. So some people like their tables to have a blank line between each row. And compact actually, you have to set compact equal to no. There's lots more functionality, and I recommend the FAQ. That's the last link. It's also linked to from the main page. I wrote it, so that's part of why I recommend it, but also it's some of the common things that people run into. So I think I'll just do the middle of these demos. So this is what the, I don't know if I can get my display to do the right thing for this. This is the converter form. So you can see the options you have there. Basically, if your goal is to upload your internet draft, you want it set to plain text and file. This RFC markup option is the script that, if you ever look at the tools.ietf.org HTML that has the links, I haven't actually tried that out, but that would give you an HTML output with links. And then scrolling down on this page, as I mentioned, is the list of the citation libraries if you're looking for that. And I thought there was a link to the wizard on this page, but there's not. So it's XML to RFC -wizard. So this is the one I mentioned a couple of times. It's basically like making your own template. Instead of starting with a template, you fill out this form, and then farther down on the page, it's creating the XML file. So it won't help you with tricky things like tables or lists, but it will help you get that front matter going. So personally, I edit my XML file in Emacs, and then I convert using XML.RFC installed on the command line, which there's not much to demo there, it just creates your text file. Okay, going over the Markdown, one of the Markdown options. So this tool is created by Karsten Borman. As mentioned, the link to his slides are there. Slides.rfc.space was his tutorial that goes into details. So I've just picked a few highlights from his tutorial to give you a taste for what his tool is like, in case you want to, if it's appealing to you. Basically, you feed a Markdown file to his tool, it creates XML, and then you feed that XML to XML.RFC, which you could either do on the command line or do using the online converter. So why would you choose this tool? As he describes, it's distraction-free writing, so you can focus on the content. The quick start guide is you use gem to install his tool and pip to install XML.RFC. Then you edit your Markdown in your favorite editor or a specific Markdown editor like Markdown or Markdown Pad. And this is what it kind of looks like. If you've edited a wiki page, it's very similar. Where I think it gets a little clunky is the table. I mean, you could argue the table is also clunky writing in XML directly. Where it says code block or just indent by greater than 4. So there's 4 tildes in a row there. And that's basically going to create a figure artwork in the XML output. And then every time you want to cite a document, you use curly braces, and that's going to be the equivalent of like xref target equals blah. And then as mentioned, some portion of the document is in YAML, which does not look like Markdown. So the references section itself and also the author information and the document metadata like its title, etc., would be more this format. Check out his tutorial slides. There's also a side-by-side converter that's a work in progress. So you have the Markdown on the left and your text output on the right. So that's the drafter. So some people, has anyone ever used drafter before? It's been around a while. Okay. So this is a new version of drafter. This is a tool by Richard Barnes. It's not complete, but it'll do the basics. And it's relying on Cramdown. So kind of just gives you an interface, a web accessible interface to the Markdown converter. Also, if you go to drafter.js, it'll give you a starter template, which you can also get from the Cramdown page. So finally, looking briefly at links to RFC, this is Nico Williams' tool, and he is not a fan of XML, so he made these slides, and apparently this, for some people, Lix is something they're already familiar with, and this is an easy way to get an XML file. And you use Lix, which is available on Linux, and as mentioned, mostly used in academia, free, stable, easy to use. A complete internet draft can be written with no XML. It does all of the functionality we've talked about. And it does let you rely on the citation library, and you can get HTML, plain text, or XML to feed to XML to RFC. So the site for that, I had the URL at the beginning of the presentation, but I do not have it on this slide. And there it is, licks.org that's for the format. Never mind, that's not his. There's a GitHub page for licks to RFC. So finally, beyond creating internet drafts, there are lots of other tools that are available, especially from tools.ietf.org. So just to give you a general idea, under search and view documents, IETF doc fetch is something you can install for in Firefox that lets you have a search bar for RFCs and internet drafts. There are a bunch of different options for diff tools if you like side-by-side diffs, or you like inline diffs, or you need to change the color of the diffs. It lets you do all of that. And the daily dose is automatically created list of links relevant new IETF information. The working groups, a lot of working groups have wikis on tools.ietf.org. The email aliases have actually been switched over to the main IETF.org. So from the data tracker pages, what I mean by an email alias is that if you know that you need to email all relevant people for a specific internet draft and ask them, you know, hey, do you have a source file, or make comments on their draft, they have set up these email aliases that are basically like the draft's name at IETF.org, but it -all usually, or if you want to email the working group chairs, you can put the working group acronym -WG, or sorry, -chairs at IETF.org. But from the data tracker pages, it'll show you what those aliases are, and they can be useful for communicating with the right people. There are also admin RSS feeds available, like keeping up with the most recently published RFCs or internet drafts. Also, as you may know, since you're at the meeting, there are various tools for helping to follow the IETF meeting. And also formal language checking. For example, if you have ABNF in your document, there's an ABNF parser available, nib review tools. So as mentioned, the XML to RFC list is a really good place to go if you have a question like, why isn't my XML file running? The RFC editor is here this week. We'll be at a desk Monday through Thursday near registration, and we're good for questions like, what tool should I start with? Or how do I get the source file for this old RFC that I'm working on the BIS document for? Or various other, who should I talk to about something? We're welcome, you're welcome to come and ask us. And there is a short survey available, surveymonkey.com, and ready for any questions. Okay, well, ended an hour early. So if you want to if you have a problem with an XML file or something that you want me to look at, welcome to bring it up here. And I highly recommend attending another tutorial. There's an internationalization tutorial if you're dealing at all with that in your working group at 3 o'clock. Or you could go catch the second half of the newcomers. There's also newcomers in Japanese going on right now. So yeah, enjoy your IETF meeting.